Hello, thank you for joining me. I wanted to show you today how to make galaxy backgrounds using black cardstock and Distress Oxides. When I was first taught this technique, I was shown to use white cardstock and layers of Distress ink or Distress Oxides. It ended up being a lot of ink that got used, and I've just discovered a way that you don't need as much ink. Your supplies will last longer, and the whole process is a lot quicker. So today I'm going to show you how to make a Distress Oxide Galaxy background and how to complete them using perfect pearls, paint, embossing powder, and texture paste. We can have a look at all of those methods together and you can decide which ones you like. Alright, so the first thing I need is black cardstock. I start with a half a sheet. If the whole background turns out great, then I cut it in half. I've got two backgrounds. If I only like a section, I'll use the section I like. I use Distress blending brushes and Distress Oxides. I use pinks, purples, blues. Yellows work really well. Really anything you have in the brighter colors. And I just put it on my black cardstock kind of haphazardly. Sometimes I use lines, sometimes just blotches. And as you can see, I just fill it in. Once you're done applying color, I switch over to black and I just put a little bit of black on, stipple it in over the color. It helps make the color a little more subtle. From there, we'll have our base background and we can complete it either using paint, embossing powder, texture paste, or the first technique I'll show you is using perfect pearls. So stay tuned and I'll show you different ways to complete this background. So here's our completed base background. I've gone ahead, I've made a few more. They're all generally the same, different colors used in some of them. And as you can see, we will turn them into some beautiful backgrounds in just a moment. Let's jump right into our first technique, using perfect pearls. This is our base background on black cardstock. Perfect pearls comes in a variety of different colors. This one is actually just called perfect pearls. It's a whitish silver color. I mix it up in a little bit of water in a mini mister, and I made this months ago, so it lasts a long time. You just shake it up before you use it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to squirt this all over the background. Let it sit for a few moments. And then I take a paper towel and just lay it on top, soak up the excess. From there, you're going to want to let it dry. It doesn't take very long, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. But as you can see, you kind of got a bright, shimmery, starry night sky. All right, moving right along here now. The next technique we're going to uses paint. You can use white acrylic paint, add a little bit of water to it. I actually use Distress paint because it's already kind of watery. And I am using the Ranger Paint Splatter brush. Maybe that's not what it's called, but that's how it's used. And you just dip the ends into the paint and you splatter it all over your cardstock. It works beautifully. It does get paint everywhere, so protect your work surface. Let's have a look. So as you can see, this paint, it splatters over the cardstock and fills it in and makes it kind of look like a starry night sky. This is probably one of my favorite techniques. So the next technique uses embossing powder to create our stars. In this case, I'm going to use Brutus Monroe Milky Way embossing powder. I'll be honest, I don't know if this is how this was supposed to be used. I ordered it on a whim. I couldn't figure out what to do with it, and this is where I ended up. So I use a Distress brush that I've, designated just for Versamark. I dip it in a Versamark pad. This one's really old, so ignore the spots on it. And I just kind of brush it over my background in random patterns. You just want the embossing powder to stick in kind of just sections. You don't want it all over. Then I cover it over with the embossing powder, and I use a coffee filter to catch my embossing powder just to try and save as much of it as I can. Load up the cardstock, And then I dump the excess back into the container. So from here, I just go back over it with my brush and remove some of the excess embossing powder. I don't want large sections. I just want it scattered all over. When I'm satisfied with that, I use a heat tool and I set the embossing powder so that it melts. And we'll see what that looks like in just a second. So this is our finished background made with embossing powder. It's glittery, it's bright, it's vibrant. I just love this technique. Our last technique is going to be using Brutus Monroe glitter glaze. This same technique can be used for any kind of texture paste, but in this case, I'm going to use the glow-in-the-dark glitter glaze. So I have a star stencil. I'm really sorry, I don't know who makes this stencil. I didn't keep the brand name or the packaging. And we're going to tape it down to our cardstock. Now, it doesn't cover the whole piece, so you'll just have to trim the background afterwards. Once it's taped down, you're going to want to use a palette knife. You can even use a popsicle stick. Dip it in your glitter glaze or your texture paste, whatever have you. And you're going to spread it along the stencil in kind of a thick layer, but you're going to want to scrape it as you go. Once the whole stencil is covered, you're going to want to remove your stencil right away. Wash your stencil, wash your tools. You don't want this to dry because once it's dried, it's not coming off. So wash it off while it's wet. Then let your background dry for a while. I give it a couple of hours, but honestly, it's dry to the touch within probably about an hour. All right, so here's our dried background. As you can see, it's kind of got a silver finish to it. It does glow in the dark. I checked that out, and I think it looks pretty good. So let's recap. Our first one we did with Perfect Pearls. It's kind of silvery and glittery all over. You got a little bit of color poking through. Next, we have one with, this was Distress Paint speckled on using a brush. Next up, Brutus Monroe Milky Way embossing powder, but you could do this effect with any embossing powder, really. Lastly, we used a texture paste. This one was Brutus Monroe Glitter Glaze in Glow in the Dark. Of course, you can always mix these techniques. This one here is Perfect Pearls, paint splatter, and embossing powder. Lastly, we have all four of our techniques on one card. We've got the Perfect Pearls, we've got paint splatter, we've got embossing powder, and we used a transparent, glossy texture paste to do our stars on our stencil. Oh, the stars on this one's a lot more subtle. Thanks for watching. I hope you've learned something. Please tell me in the comments if you've tried any of those techniques and which ones are your favorites.